There, now it's on.
Jim, he said it wasn't.
No, I think I just turned it on now.
Well, I saw the picture on it.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Cal. What else was I supposed to remember? Anyway, we're in the period of the judges. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes, and we have the judges cycle where they sin, God disciplines them, eventually they cry out to God, and a judge is given. This judge leads them to victory, and they serve God for the lifespan of the judge. The judge dies, and they start this cycle all over again. So for 380 years, they have sin, discipline, crying out to God, a deliverer. Sin, discipline, crying out to God, deliverer. And they keep going through this. And so we have the judges, Othniel the first one, Ehud, Shamgar. Some of these will ring a bell and really stand out in your mind. Deborah, Gideon, Barak, Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Isbin, Elon, Abdon, Samson, Eli, and Samuel. But in contrast, now this goes to the same period. When you read, the book of Judges is not a good one to read before you go to bed. It has them cutting up people and sending the 12 pieces to the 12 tribes and all kinds of things. A bloody, sinful, really rough era. And then you read the book of Ruth. And it's interesting because Ruth comes from the period of the judges. But you wouldn't think so. Because here we have a beautiful love story and the story of a Gentile turning to God. And we have a young woman living with purity and with conviction and with determination, all in this period of chaos. And this is interesting because very often, I was in youth work for the first 13 years of my ministry, and that goes back a while. It was interesting because yesterday I got a ticket, but I got a ticket for driving in Seattle on October 23rd and ran a red light. I think that's what I did. And what had happened is the person who bought my truck never switched it. And so he ran a red light. I got the ticket. So we got that unraveled. But it was kind of an interesting thing because I thought, well, how did I get a ticket? I wasn't even in Seattle. What's interesting is that anyway, I spent the first 13 years of my ministry in high school and college youth work. And the high school had drugs and everything, and you had the druggies and you had the hippies and everything. But you also, running counter to that culture, you had kids living for God and living upright and interested in studies and everything. So within any given society, you'll have these different things going on. You can't just say, okay, my society is bad, I don't have a chance. You do, and Ruth proved this. Because in the midst of this, we have a wonderful contrast in the life of Ruth. That brings us to the sixth period, the period of the kingdom. For the part of the period of the kingdom, people are fairly familiar. What part? There are actually three. This is a nice period. It covers 120 years, rounding again. David 40, Saul 40, David, Solomon. Let's repeat that. Unrepeat that. Saul 40 years, David 40 years, and Solomon 40 years. So that's, again, we're rounding off there. But we have these characters. And this is usually one of the better known periods in people's Bible facts. Why? So many stories that we cover in Sunday school, you know, as kids, David and Goliath and all of these stories. And so this, and Solomon being the wisest man who ever lived. And it was interesting because Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, wasn't smart enough to take his own advice and ended up in trouble. And very often that happens to us. It isn't that we don't know right, it's that we don't do right. So we have that period, period 6. That brings us to period 7. And this is the divided kingdom. Solomon dies. His son Rehoboam comes to rule. And Solomon had not finished well. And so Rehoboam, his son, is trying, and here again, sometimes you wish they'd name them George and Peter, because we have Rehoboam and Jeroboam. And so, and we have because of Rehoboam not listening to bad advice instead of wise, experienced advice, the kingdom is taken from him and is given to Rehoboam. And you can keep those two straightened out because the J's don't go together. Israel, we have Jeroboam. Judah, we have Rehoboam. If we look at this, Israel is also called Ephraim after the largest tribe. So as you're reading, if it's talking about Israel, it's talking about the northern tribe. If it talks about Ephraim, that's also the northern tribe. The northern tribe actually had 10 tribes. 10 tribes are ripped from Rehoboam, Solomon's son, ripped from his hand and given to Rehoboam. The capital becomes Samaria. In the northern tribes, we have 19 kings, 9 dynasties, all wicked. Not a good one in the bunch. They're taken captive to Assyria in 722. This is also the beginning of the Samaritans. 2 Kings 17 tells the story of the Samaritans. And that whole thing carries clear into the New Testament. You have the Good Samaritan and so on. So that's Israel, the northern tribe. Judah is called Judah, again after the largest tribe. The first king is Rehoboam. There are only 2 tribes. The capital is Jerusalem. There are 20 kings, all descendants of David, some good, some bad, and some indifferent. But this is the divided kingdom. The kingdom has been split, and we have the period of the divided kingdom. When Israel goes captive, that leaves Judah alone. Now, I think Burroughs he doesn't include this period. I divide it and stick it in there because this is a period of 135 years. So I think it merits and quite a bit of text. Judah alone. Judah, after the fall of Israel, continues for another 135 years. But they become guilty of the same sins as Israel, and they're taken captive in 2 waves, 605 and then another one in 586. 605, Daniel is in that first batch. And then in 586, Jerusalem finally falls. And that brings us to the 9th period, the period of captivity. Basically, the captivity, Israel has already been captive for 135 years, and Israel never returns from captivity. The captivity of Judah lasts for 49 years, 70 years if you compute it from the first wave in 605 to 536 when the temple was started, at the starting of the rebuilding of the temple. But Judah comes alone. That brings us to the period of restoration. This takes place in 3 waves. This probably most Bible